on Azure. And before we get started with the content today, and before I hand it off to our main presenter today, there's just a couple housekeeping items I'd like to just quickly go over with you now. If you first take a look on the left-hand side of your On24 webinar screen, you'll notice a Q&A window. And we're joined today by several subject matter experts, and they are on the Q&A line, and they'll be happy to answer any questions you have. And so we'll be answering questions in real time today, and we'll do our best to get to everything as it's coming in. If you now look over on the right-hand side of your webinar screen, you'll see a list of resources. And so you'll notice that any hyperlinks you see in the media player of the presentation today, you'll notice you can't click on those links there. So we've gone ahead and listed out all of those in the resource list on the right, and you can click on those whenever you'd like. Lastly, below that, you'll see a survey box. And so when we're finished with the webinar today, we would really appreciate it if you would please take a moment to fill out that survey. This will really help us determine the sort of webinars we'll be putting out in coming weeks and months, and this will also just really let us know what you thought of the webinar today. Also, we often get the question, will the slides from today's webinar be available afterwards? And the answer is, unfortunately, we won't be sending out the actual slides, but you will be sent the on-demand recording exactly as you're seeing it today, and that'll be coming to you by email within 48 hours, so you can keep an eye out for that in your inbox. So now I'd like to hand it off to our main presenter. Enough with the housekeeping now. So we're joined by Pravitra, who is a Windows Virtual Desktop Program Manager. Pravitra, whenever you're ready, I'd like to hand the mic over to you.
Thank you, Nick. So hello, everybody, and welcome to the session on migrating virtualization workloads to Azure. Today, I will be covering both migration to remote desktop services as well as to Windows Virtual Desktop Services from on-prem to Azure. And at the end of the session, I'm hoping that you will understand what the prerequisites are, what the migration paths are for customers to migrate to Azure, as well as what kind of requirements and what kind of steps are encompassed in this whole migration. All right, so before we get into the specifics of how to migrate your virtualization workloads and what are the steps that are involved in it, let's take a look at why customers actually migrate to Azure. So one of the biggest reasons that we are seeing of late for customers to explore migration options to Azure is the end of support for Windows 7 and Windows Server 2008. And as you know, Windows Virtual Desktop actually supports Windows 7 as well as offers 3 years of free extended security updates. And so customers are exploring options of migrating the Windows 7 workloads to Azure. The second biggest reason that we have seen from our customers moving to Azure is the whole hardware refresh recycle. They don't want to be locked down for multiple years using the same hardware. They don't want to sink in costs to procure more hardware, and hence they are looking at always using the latest hardware on Azure. And the other biggest driver to Azure is the fact that a lot of customers are moving to seasonal workers. And so the number of workers could potentially change from month to month. The kind of usage patterns that these employees have would also change from month to month. And it's easier to have a presence on Azure so you can actually manage these workloads that can be tailored for both the capacity of the seasonal employees as well as the kind of usage pattern that you've got for the seasonal employees. Some of the other reasons that customers migrate to Azure are for mergers and acquisitions. And if two companies have completely different virtualization environments and they're either merging or one is acquired by the other, it's easier to set up a new environment on Azure and basically just have all these employees connect to this new environment instead of trying to merge these two different on-prem environments. So these are some of the main reasons that customers move to Azure. And so what are the prerequisites that you as a customer would need to look at before you start migrating your virtualization workloads to Azure? The first thing is you need to definitely have an Azure subscription because you're going to have virtual machines. You're going to have multiple resources and they all need an Azure subscription. The second thing is you need to have some kind of Active Directory presence. So if you're going to be doing remote desktop services in Azure, it has to be Active Directory. If you're going to be having Windows Virtual Desktop in Azure, then it can either be Active Directory or Domain Controller. But you definitely need to have some kind of Active Directory or Domain Controller presence in this particular Azure subscription. Secondly, you would need the right licensing for you to use either RDS or WVD. So for RDS, you would need Windows Server and RDS CALs or SALs. And for Windows Virtual Desktop, you can use it with any of these licenses that are mentioned here. As long as you have one of these licenses, you will be entitled to use Windows Virtual Desktop. And then lastly, I specifically calling out the VM image because this is going to be the set of applications and the resources that you're trying to virtualize. And so depending on whether you're doing a lift and shift kind of a migration or you're going to do some kind of a new set of apps that you want to virtualize, you will still need to have a golden image that you want to create VMs with. All right, so these are the prerequisites before you move to Azure. Now let's look at the steps that are involved in this whole migration process. We have 4 distinct steps that are assessment, migration, optimization, and lastly, security and management of the environment. So assessment, as it says, is the actual initial assessment of your existing virtual environment. And based on that assessment, it also entails planning and preparing before you actually do the migration. The migration step is where you perform the actual migration, and you either do a lift and shift migration or you migrate to Windows Virtual Desktop. And lastly, optimization, security, and management. These 2 actually are cyclic, wherein you are optimizing for both cost as well as management on Azure, and you're improving security and adding either more applications or you're doing some kind of user management, which feeds back into optimization. So these are the 4 distinct steps that you have in the whole migration process. In the upcoming slides, we are going to be going into depth for each of these steps. All right, so let's take a look at what the assessment step entails. So this is a step where you're going to be learning about your existing virtualization environment. You're going to be looking at a set of VMs that you're trying to migrate and then understanding what the operating system that is running on these VMs are, what kind of applications are running, what is the actual VM size and memory, what are the licenses that you already have, and what kind of users actually access those applications. Apart from that, you're also going to be looking at what kind of dependencies, applications, or whatever is running on those VM have on the rest of the environment. You're going to be looking at how those VMs are being set up. Are they set up in a pooled environment? Are they set up in a personal desktop kind of environment? How many users are connecting to it on a particular VM? So user density is going to be something which is very important. And lastly, you're going to be looking at how these users are using these applications. Are they using it the whole 8 hours that they are logged into the virtualization environment? Are they using it maybe, in passing, maybe 5 minutes in a week? Those are going to feed into your planning and preparation phase, wherein you're taking all the learnings from the assessment and then deciding what exactly you're going to be moving to Azure. So you're definitely going to be moving it in stages. These virtualization environments generally happen in stages, right? So you're going to look at what kind of applications I can actually try out on Azure today, wherein I can reach the maximum number of users in my environment. So if you have one application which is used 8 hours a day and you've got one which is used for 5 minutes in a week, you're definitely going to choose that one application that's going to be used 8 hours a day and migrate it first because you want to reach the maximum number of users. Secondly, if you have absolutely no licenses that for you to run on Windows Virtual Desktop and that's what you want to run on, this is the place where you're going to go look at how many users are going to use it, and then procure the right licenses accordingly. You're also going to be looking at operating systems very specifically on whether those operating systems are actually supported on Azure or not. If you are using very, very old operating systems, clearly they are not going to be supported on Azure. So you either try to upgrade your operating system at this point, or you leave applications that need those operating systems just running on-prem. That is definitely a possibility, and it's potential that you look at it and then you say that, hey, only 5% of my whole number of users are actually using that particular application that requires that older operating system, so I can continue running it on-prem, whereas everything else can be modernized and put up on Azure. So assessment is actually one of the most critical steps that are needed prior to the actual migration process. At this point, I want to show you two tools that do the assessment, albeit in a slightly different way. So the first thing that I want to show is the Azure Migrate tool. So Azure Migrate tool is something that, of course, Microsoft owns and manages. It's a Microsoft tool, and what it does is it basically looks at a set of VMs that are running in an on-prem data center and comes up with an assessment of it. So here I have multiple assessments that I have done based on multiple groups of VMs. So I've got some of the VMs are just two VMs per group. Some of them are 10 VMs per group. But then based on that, I can have multiple assessment. And what an assessment basically does is it tells you first and foremost how many VMs it looked at, out of which how many of them can just be lifted and shifted to Azure. So you don't need to really do anything. You can just take them as is and then have them migrated to Azure. Some of them you might need to do some kind of upgrade. You might have to remove certain applications that are not supported on Azure. And apart from the actual Azure readiness, it also tells you what kind of VMs need to be created in Azure to support those workloads that are running on the on-prem VMs. So once you have this information, apart from this, it tells you more information on the actual monthly cost. It talks about both compute as well as storage cost. And if you're doing a lift and shift, this would potentially be the maximum cost that you can incur, because during your optimization phase, you can definitely increase user density. You can potentially go and upgrade the VM size, and you can definitely have dynamic scaling to control the number of VMs that are running at a particular point of time. And so whatever monthly cost this gives you, you can definitely take it as a maximum estimate, and you can, definitely work to reduce that once you are already on Azure. So this is one such tool, which is Azure Migrate. I'm going to show you another example of a partner tool. So we have a partner, Lakeside, one of many partners that have assessment tool, and this is the assessment that they have provided on a Citrix environment. The same kind of assessment can be got for remote desktop services, VMware, any kind of virtual environment using Lakeside, and this is true for all the assessment partners that we have. And so what this kind of assessment does is it gives you information specifically on the virtualization environment. What is it that you're virtualized? How is the usage pattern on those applications, et cetera, et cetera. Azure Migrate gives you more information on the VM itself, what is running on VM, what are the performance metrics on the VM, what is ready to be migrated, etc. But it doesn't tell you how many users are using a particular application. It doesn't tell you whether an application has the right licensing, etc., etc. Whereas virtualization-specific assessment tools like this one from Lakeside will give you that information. So let's take a look at what this particular assessment tool gives you. It gives you, first and foremost, a user experience score. Now, the user experience score might not mean anything at this point of time as part of your assessment, but this is going to be very important post-migration. When you're doing optimization and when you're doing management, user experience score is going to be something that you're going to keep visiting because you want to understand whether the migration was successful from a user experience perspective or not. So this gives you information on the user experience as well as the number of VMs as well and servers that are running in your environment. It gives you information on the breakdown of the operating systems that are running in your environment. So this is going to be important for you because our legacy operating systems are here, and that's the majority of your virtualization workload, this will be the time that you go back and say, hey, 38% is actually running 2003 or something like that, and I think it's time for me to upgrade it so that they're either using Windows 10 or Windows Server 2016, etc. So this will give you insight on whether you need to upgrade or you can just do lift and shift. Importantly, this tells you what are all the applications that are running in your virtual environment. It tells you how many times the users have actually used this. So as I mentioned earlier, if there is a very low percentage of users using a particular application, that might definitely not cut it out to be in the first step of migration. So this gives you information. And the other information it gives you is per application. It tells you how many unique users are using it in your environment across the time that you have done the assessment. It also tells you what kind of user experience these users had per application. So when you do migrate and you're trying to assess the user experience, you can definitely do it at a per app level also and not necessarily look at an overall user experience because you might not have the same number of apps running on every VM on Azure. So this gives you very, very specific insight into what is happening on your present virtualization environment, and you can do the right planning and preparation based on that, and this will feed directly into your next step. The next step in your migration process is going to be the actual Azure Migrate path. And so before we get into what are the different steps that are part of your migration, let's look at what are the different paths a customer can take to migrate their workloads to Azure. So the first thing they can do is the burst to Azure model, wherein all infrastructure, all application dependencies, all storage, everything resides on-prem. The only thing that they create on Azure are the actual VMs running the golden images with their applications on it. And what this allows the customer to do is it allows the customer to understand first and foremost the various aspects of Azure, because quite a lot of customers are going to be new to Azure. So this allows them to get comfortable with Azure, create a virtual network, and have as minimal as number of resources as possible to test out the VM sizes, the user density, the actual application performance, etc. on Azure. Generally, this kind of model is used for specifically seasonal worker kind of scenarios, but also as an initial validation step in the overall migration process. The most popular migration path that we have seen to Azure so far is the lift and shift method. So what the lift and shift method does is it recreates every single resource that you have on-prem on Azure. And you use a homegrown tool, which is the Azure Site Replica that Microsoft owns, to do the actual lift and shift migration process. And so this is a very quick migration methodology. You don't really need to do too much of preparation and planning. The only thing that you would need to know is whether the operating system is supported on Azure or not. And the minute you know it's supported on Azure, Azure Migrate already has the right information on recommended VM sizes. You basically use that, and then you do the lift and shift into Azure. The biggest concern with this particular step is the fact that you will not be leveraging any cloud native features here, because you're going to be using every single thing that you used on-prem on Azure. You're going to be having, for example, you're not going to be using Azure SQL database. You're going to be using just a normal SQL server instance in your virtual network. And so though this is something that you can perform quickly, it definitely requires some rework post-migration. So during the optimization phase, you will have to go and do some kind of migration to using other supporting services from Azure, so you can leverage as many cloud-native features as possible once you're done with your initial migration. And the last thing is the whole modern approach of using Windows Virtual Desktop as part of your migration. And what this allows you to do is it allows you to use your cloud-native features. For example, for identity and security, you can use Azure Active Directory. You can use Azure SQL Database. Essentially, everything that Azure offers, you can use as part of your migration to Azure. if you're going to migrate your virtualization workloads into Windows Virtual Desktop. The biggest downside to this is that it definitely requires a lot more assessment, a lot more planning and preparation prior to migration. The actual migration might be an easier path, but the amount of time it's going to take for you to rework the virtualization infrastructure as well as the network architecture is something that you definitely need to take into consideration before you move into Windows Virtual Desktop. So these are the three different paths that one can take into Azure. So let's take a look at the high-level steps that are part of migrating remote desktop services to Azure. So the very first thing a customer would do is they will set up a virtual network on Azure. And then if there is any kind of connectivity that they want to have with their on-prem data center, they can either use site-to-site VPN or ExpressRoute to connect the on-prem data center to Azure Virtual Network. Then the second thing that they will do is set up Active Directory inside this virtual network. Given that this is remote desktop services, there has to be an Active Directory presence there. So you can either set it up as a new Active Directory, which nobody's going to do because they definitely want to do some kind of migration, or just replicate the on-prem Active Directory to Azure. And the third step is where you're going to be creating the remote desktop services virtualization infrastructure components on Azure. So this is where you're going to be using the ARM templates that the RDS team has developed and given to you as a customer to basically set up the RD Gateway, RD Connection Broker, RD Web, RD licensing on Azure. The ARM templates allow you to set up a standalone single instance set of components, or you're allowed to also set up a high availability architecture using those ARM templates. So once the infrastructure is set up, then you go ahead and create the virtual machines that are now going to be part of this RDS infrastructure. Now the way you do it again could be just a lift and shift method wherein you're replicating every single VM from on-prem. Or you can create your own golden image based on whether you want to have a subset of applications that you have on-prem on Azure. So you can create a new golden image and then just create new VMs that are joined to the RDS infrastructure here. And then once all of this is done, you basically sync your application and user data or your user profile disks from on-prem to Azure. If you're not interested in actually having any kind of roaming user profile, then you will just be doing the synchronization of app data so that the application data can be accessible on Azure. So these are the 5 high-level steps that are part of your migration. The tool that we recommend is Azure Site Replica, ASR, which allows you to basically replicate both server as well as client queues. So as of last month, which is May, you can actually replicate client queues also using this particular tool. All right, so I just want to give you a quick look at what our recommended virtual network architecture is. So if you are new to Azure, Azure has this concept of hub and spoke virtual network, wherein you have an on-prem data center, and then you have one hub virtual network that's created on Azure that's connected to your on-prem data center using an ExpressRoute or a site-to-site VPN. And then you can have one or multiple spoke virtual network. Those spoke virtual networks are completely locked on networks. They have their own virtual network, and you're potentially going to have your virtualization workloads in your spoke virtual network. And the way the spoke and the hub are connected is they are virtual network peered. So there is peer pairing between these two virtual networks. And there is no direct exposure of the spoke virtual networks to the outside world. All the traffic has to flow through the ExpressRoute back to the on-prem data center. So we have had feedback from customers saying that this is a very attractive virtual network architecture and that they are going to be using this. So I just want to let you know about this particular recommendation from us. The second thing I want to talk about here are the different user personas that the RDS team has come across. So these are the different user personas, which is the task worker, knowledge worker, professional worker, and the power worker. And based on the kind of user persona, you're going to be having a recommended VM. So in our case, it is DS4, and you're going to be having the specific user density per core on those VMs. And so based on the reason you have different kinds of user density is in the table down below, you have information on the kind of applications each one of these user personas are going to be using. And so some of the user personas have really heavy duty applications running, and hence you don't want to have too many users on the VM if they are all going to be using those heavy duty applications. And generally those are the power users. So for power users, our recommendation is one user per core, and you use an N-series VM. Whereas for the other three kinds of users, you have 6 users or 4 or 3 users per core, and you can start off with a D4SV3 kind of a VM. In the optimization phase, you can definitely change the size of the VM as well as the user density, but this is just something that I wanted to point out as our recommendation. All right, so let's take a look at what the lift and shift method actually does, right? So you have an on-prem infrastructure along with all your virtual network and, all your virtual machines, and the user profile disk, file server, Active Directory, everything. What the lift and shift method basically does, it basically creates an exact replica of what is there on-prem on Azure. A lot of times the lift and shift method using ASR is used as a high availability disaster recovery kind of a scenario wherein you recreate every single component that you have on-prem on Azure, but then operate it in an active passive mode. But this is actually one of the ways that you're going to be doing your migration. You create an exact replica on Azure. You test it out with Azure being the active and the on-prem being the passive. And then once everything is done, you can get rid of your infrastructure components from on-prem. So what the lift and shift method allows you to do is it allows you to migrate small sets of users and determine what is the optimal user density that you can have per VM, what are the right VM sizes for the chosen set of applications. It also allows you to validate the actual applications that are there in the golden image. So just because you've gone through golden image creation during the planning and preparation phase does not mean that that's the best golden image that you can have for these set of users. So this allows you to go and validate it. But most importantly, it allows you to determine the app dependencies that are there from your Azure network to your on-prem network. There's going to be a lot of data that's going to flow through your express router, your site-to-site VPN, depending on these app dependencies. So this particular evaluation will feed into choosing the right applications to be run on Azure if there is any dependencies on-prem. So the lift and shift method I already mentioned, you can do it with ASR, and it's a very popular way of migrating your virtualization workloads to Azure. So let's take a look at now the second migration path, which is the migration to Windows Virtual Desktop. So the high-level steps in this is, again, very similar to your previous RDS to Azure. You need to create a virtual network environment on Azure and then connect it to on-prem if you have any app dependencies to on-prem. The second thing is, remember, VMs in a Windows Virtual Desktop environment need to be Active Directory domain joined. So you either set up an Active Directory in the virtual network, or you should be having some kind of domain controller in this Azure Virtual Network. Then the other thing is Windows Virtual Desktop uses Azure Active Directory for the first line of authentication of the users. And so once you set up the Active Directory, you need to ensure that Azure Active Directory and Active Directory are actually synced. So you need to ensure that the usernames and password hashes are synced between Azure Active Directory and Active Directory. Once this is done, you basically create objects in the Windows Virtual Desktop environment. So you will be creating a tenant and you'll be creating a host pool. And as part of the host pool creation, you're going to be generating a secret, which we call the registration token or registration secret. And this is going to be used in those VMs that are going to be joined to Windows Virtual Desktop. So after step 4, you create the actual VMs. Now the VMs can be created again using either a golden image, or you can actually replicate it using ASR from on-prem. But let's assume that you have created the VMs, and you basically need to just use the RD agent that Windows Virtual Desktop gives you. You drop it into those VMs and you supply it with this registration token that you generated in step 4. The minute you do that, the VMs will be joined to the Windows Virtual Desktop environment, and then if you have users connecting, these VMs now will be used as part of those user connectivity. And the last thing here is that you would need to convert your application and user data into profile containers. So if you are migrating from remote desktop services on on-prem to Azure, you have multiple ways of doing this. SS Logic profile containers is supported on all virtualization environments. So you can convert your user profile disks that are used with remote desktop services to profile containers in the on-prem data center itself. And this can be done as part of your assessment phase. Once you are done with the conversion and you've got that running for a while, when you migrate those collections to Windows Virtual Desktop, all you will need to do is to synchronize the profile containers to Azure, and you can continue using the same profile containers for the same users on Azure. The other way of doing it is that you continue using user profile disks on your RDS environments on-prem, and then when you move to Azure, you convert the user profile disks to profile containers and just have them running on Azure alone. But either ways, I want to ensure that you understand that Windows Virtual Desktop does not support user profile disks, and hence if you want to have any kind of roaming profile, you will definitely need to convert your user profile disks to profile containers if you're going to be migrating to Windows Virtual Desktop. All right, so let's take a look at how this looks pictorially. And here I'm actually going to give you an example of a customer that has set up, that originally had an RDS environment on-prem, and they have now done a lift and shift, and they have an RDS environment on Azure. And now they are planning on moving from RDS to Windows Virtual Desktop because they have gone through some initial validation and seems to work for them. So what they will do is they will basically register with Windows Virtual Desktop, wherein they create the tenant and the host pool that I mentioned earlier, and they generate the registration secret. And then they will install the RD agent on these desktops and applications that are running in their own virtual network. They will install the RD agent and supply it to the registration token. And the minute that happens, those VMs now will be part of Windows Virtual Desktop. They will have to remove those VMs from the RDS on Azure infrastructure. But then the same VMs are now running as part of Windows Virtual Desktop infrastructure. Lastly, what they can do is once all the VMs are actually migrated to the Windows Virtual Desktop service, they can just get rid of the RDS infrastructure completely from Azure. I would recommend they do this after at least 1 or 2 months of stable running on the Windows Virtual Desktop environment. And as I mentioned earlier, UPD by itself is not supported on Windows Virtual Desktop, so they will have to convert it into profile containers, and they can continue using the data and app itself in the Windows Virtual Desktop environment. So these are actually pretty simple steps that a customer can take to migrate from RDS to Windows Virtual Desktop and reuse the VMs that they have already validated instead of creating brand new VMs. All right, so everything that we have spoken so far, apart from just plain lift and shift, is applicable for pooled collections. So pooled set of VMs wherein every single image on the VMs are the same. Users accessing those VMs do not have admin privileges, so the VMs don't really look too different from each other. But what about migrating personal desktops from on-prem to Azure? ASR is still going to be the same tool that we recommend you use for migrating these kind of desktops from on-prem to Azure. What ASR allows you to do is it creates an exact copy of the VM on Azure. It allows the synchronization to be both ways. So let's say you want to try out how the user experience is on Azure. You can make the Azure VM active and let the user try it out. And if you want to continue using the on-prem environment, you can then turn on the on-prem VM to be active. And the synchronization would have already ensured that all the changes that were done on the Azure VM is already replicated to the on-prem VM. And so the users by themselves don't lose any user data or application data that they modified in the Azure VM. This allows you to take your time to find out how the user experience is on Azure and then migrate these personal desktop environments slowly. We recommend this definitely for session hosts. We are exploring other opportunities and options for Windows 10 and Windows 7 because right now Windows 10 and Windows 7 need remote desktop virtualization host in an RDS environment for them to be run in a virtual environment, whereas with Windows Virtual Desktop, you really don't need that. So if you're using RDS to RDS, and it's a personal desktop, you can definitely use ASR to replicate RDVH on-prem to RDVH on Azure. The only thing that we need to still explore options is to support the migration of personal desktops from RDS to Windows Virtual Desktop. All right, so let's look at the third and the fourth steps of the migration process, which is going to be optimize and then secure and manage. So what does the optimize step actually entail? What this basically does is it gives you the opportunity to go back and look at your environment and say, hey, I've got these set of personal desktops that I have migrated. Do I really need all these users to get a personal desktop? There are a bunch of users who never go and update anything on their desktops because they really don't need to do anything. They just use applications, right? So there is opportunity for you to go and examine your migrated environment and then decide whether you want to move users away from personal desktops to pool desktops. This is also a time wherein you can look at the new versions of operating systems. So if you have actually just migrated 2012 Windows Server 2012 R2 from on-prem to Azure, you can use this step to actually go and upgrade it to Windows Server 2016 or Windows Server 2019 and see how that works for all the applications that are running in your environment. This also gives you the capability of looking at any kind of cloud-native features that and services that Azure offers. Like instead of using file servers, do you want to use Azure Files? Instead of using Golden Image Update for operating system updates, do you want to use Azure Update Management Service that allows you to update Windows Server operating systems using Azure? So this is the step wherein you're going to be tuning the environment for both cost benefits as well as reducing management overhead. One of the biggest management challenges is in making sure that VMs are running the latest version of applications. If you have one golden image for 1,000 VMs, this is going to be a big management overhead. So you might want to start exploring other supplemental services like app layering to ease your management of applications themselves. As I mentioned earlier, you should be looking at reducing costs of VMs by increasing the user density, having the right size VMs for the user persona as well as application, and lastly, looking at having some kind of scaling functionality on these VMs. So the Windows Virtual Desktop as well as Remote Desktop Services, both of them have tools that allow you to do on-demand and schedule-based scaling of VMs. So that way you're not really having VMs run 24/7 when they are not really being used for 24/7. And so this is the step wherein you go and look at all these kind of optimizations on your existing virtual environment. Actually, not existing, the migrated virtual environment. And the management phase is wherein you're going to be adding or removing users, adding or removing applications for these users as part of the same VM, so you're going to be just updating the VMs with new golden images or creating more collections and host pools with new applications. But irrespective of whether you're going to be adding users or applications, you need to monitor these workloads constantly to understand what the user experience is. Because even if you're just doing an operating system update, there could potentially be negative user impacts on the user experience, and you might have to go and either roll back the operating system update or refactor the golden image to have better user experience. And so once you monitor the environment, it feeds back into your optimization phase, wherein you're again looking at how you can, reduce cost and reduce the management overhead, et cetera, et cetera. So these are the 4 main steps in your migration process. Now let's take a look at when do you actually migrate to RDS in Azure and when do you migrate to Windows Virtual Desktop. Of course, this differs from scenario to scenario and customer to customer, but there are some, recommended guidelines that we want to talk about here. So RDS in Azure is very useful when you have VMs in a hybrid environment. By hybrid, I mean you've got VMs running on Azure as well as VMs running on-prem, both of them being managed by the same infrastructure. Windows Virtual Desktop does not support on-prem VMs. It supports hybrid environment where all the VMs are on Azure, but the backend itself is connected to on-prem. So there are app dependencies on-prem. All that is perfectly fine with Windows Virtual Desktop, but it expects all VMs to be on Azure. Whereas with remote desktop services, you can have the infrastructure on Azure and then VMs spread across Azure on-prem. Or you can have the infrastructure on-prem and then VMs spread across Azure and on-prem. The second biggest thing is that a lot of customers want to control their own infrastructure. So they want to control their own maintenance window. They want to ensure that they are in a locked-down environment. And all these things can be ensured by using RDS on Azure. With Windows Virtual Desktop, you definitely need some kind of internet-facing capability because it is on Azure. The infrastructure is going to be on public URLs. Of course, since it's a service offered by Azure, you don't have control of the maintenance window. And so if you really want complete control of your infrastructure, then RDS is the way to go. Lastly, hopefully this is something that most customers will not be stopped with. But then if you don't have the right WVD licensing and you really don't want to procure new licenses, then you can continue using RDS on Azure because you've been using RDS on-prem for a while. So these are 3 reasons for you to use RDS on Azure. Now, when do you use Windows Virtual Desktop? First thing is that Windows Virtual Desktop offers Windows 10 in a multi-session mode. So if you want to use a client operating system, especially for app compat, and most users are used to a client operating system, then Windows Virtual Desktop is the clear answer here. Secondly, if you're already looking at migrating your identity provider to Azure Active Directory, then Windows Virtual Desktop already uses Azure Active Directory for its identity and security, and hence that's the right path to choose. Thirdly, RDS does not support greater than 5,000 users, whereas Windows Virtual Desktop definitely supports larger than 5,000 users in the environment, and so that's a clear path for you to take if you have a large number of users using their environment. And then, of course, I've already talked about the fact that Windows Virtual Desktop supports 3 years of free extended security updates on Windows 7. But I want to call out that we have made to support for Office 365 Pro Plus optimization. So users using Windows Virtual Desktop will have an optimized experience of using Office 365 apps on Windows Virtual Desktop. So these are some of the considerations that we want you to take before you decide on whether you want to go to RDS on Azure or Windows Virtual Desktop on Azure. All right, so I did talk about Azure Migrate before, as well as ASR before, and I also gave you an example of another partner solution for assessment, which is from Lakeside. But we do have multiple partners that assist you, the customer, during the different phases that I talked about. Here are some of the examples that we have for the different phases that our partners support. So I talked to you about Lakeside, but Liquidware is another partner that helps you with the whole assessment phase. During migration, there are some other partners like Parallels that allow you to migrate, and they actually do the migration for you. Liquidware has app layering technology that will allow you to, with ease, layer app, whether it's on Azure or on-prem, and so it allows you during the migration phase to have as less management overhead as possible. And then during the management phase, we have CloudJumper, PeopleTech, Parallels, Liquid, all of them helping out during the management phase. So if you, for example, have CloudJumper as a management platform during your on-prem, with your on-prem environment, you can continue using it in Windows Virtual Desktop as well as RDS environments on Azure. So these are actually just examples of RDS partners. We have a lot more RDS partners that you can find in Partner Central. All right, so here we are at the end of the presentation, and I hope you got more information on how the assessment tools help you and what kind of information you get in the assessment phase, what are the different migration paths that are there to Azure, and when you can choose remote desktop services over Windows Virtual Desktop and vice versa. And lastly, I hope you got more information on the tools that are available as well as the partners that we have today as part of migration. Thank you so much, and I'm handing it over to Nick.